Today, the man known as a Golden State Killer will face his victims in court. It's the first of 4 days of hearings before Joseph DeAngelo is sentenced to life in prison. The former police officer avoided being caught for 4 decades. He has admitted to 13 murders and nearly 50 rapes in the 70s and 80s around California. His plea deal will spare him the death penalty. 16 of his rape victims plan to confront him today.
The man police believe is the Golden State Killer won't go on trial until next year. Police say DNA evidence links Joseph DeAngelo to at least 13 murders and more than 50 rapes across California in the 1970s and 80s. He was in court for less than 10 minutes Thursday. His lawyers asked for more time to prepare their defense. The judge agreed to do so. DeAngelo will be back in court in late January.
Believe it or not, today marks 1 year since police arrested East Area rapist and Golden State Killer suspect Joseph DeAngelo. He's now in jail waiting for his trial, and we've learned a lot about this case in just the last year. Here's the backstory. Last year, police arrested DeAngelo at his Citrus Heights home. Investigators used DNA to connect him to 13 murders and more than 50 rapes across California in the 70s and 80s. It was a brutal crime spree with no leads for decades. Sacramento District Attorney Anne-Marie Schubert is leading the case against him. Earlier this month, we found out prosecutors are going to seek the death penalty. And keep in mind, DeAngelo has not even entered a plea yet. Now, Daniela Pardo is here with me now because there is still a lot more to come in this case. The trial hasn't even started yet. There's so much evidence, and 6 different counties have to work together on it. It's like the ultimate group project, and it will not come cheap. Daniela, do we know how soon this trial could start and just how much money we're talking here?
You know, I think that's what a lot of us want to know, a lot of us who are following this case, but we still don't know when. I talked to the DA's office today, and I asked for an estimated timeline. They couldn't give me one. They couldn't even say a year or 2 years. You have to remember, we're talking about 40 years worth of evidence, and they're expecting to call more than 200 witnesses for this trial. Now, what we do know is that the county so far is roughly estimating it for it to be more than $20 million, and that does include DeAngelo's prosecution and defense.
Now, the interesting thing is, I know that you were saying there's a local assembly member that's trying to pass some legislation that would figure out a way for counties to get what, reimbursed for that money?
That's right. That's Assemblymember Jim Cooper. He represents Elk Grove, Galt, and Lodi. And that bill that he's trying to pass, it was heard by the Assembly Committee, a local government today. It passed that, but it still has a way to go before it makes its way to the Senate.
Now, I know the other thing is you've had a chance to speak to some of the alleged victims' families, and I just can't imagine what this experience is like for them.
Absolutely. Over the last year, I've met several of them, and what this year has brought for them is not just closure, but it's brought a sisterhood of them together. So every time that they meet, one of them told me today, I talked to her on the phone, and she said, yeah, every time that there's a trial, we get together at someone's house, and they've been able to just be there for each other.
So then the next question is, do we know what happens next? Is there a kind of a roadmap of what to expect?
All we know right now is that his next court appearance is in August, but again, we still just don't know when it's going to go to trial at this point.
Something I know we'll be following and you're going to stay on top of.
That's right.
Daniela Pardo, thank you.
We begin with that breaking story. It was a dramatic morning just minutes ago that was years in the making.
Serial killer Joseph DeAngelo apologizing for his horrendous crime spree in California. Moments ago, DeAngelo was sentenced to life in prison. CBS 2's Amy Johnson is live in the newsroom with the latest. Amy, good morning.
Well, DeMarco and Suzanne, good morning. Joseph DeAngelo was slapped with multiple life sentences. He pleaded guilty to 13 counts of murder and 13 rapes. Now, DeAngelo is a former police officer who murdered 13 people back in the 70s and 80s. As part of a plea deal, he also admitted to nearly 50 other rapes in order to avoid the death penalty. His crimes stretch all the way from Orange County to Northern California. Today's sentencing caps 3 days of emotional statements from the families that DeAngelo raped, robbed, and killed. After days of silence, DeAngelo stood and made a brief statement apologizing for his many crimes.
I've listened to all your statements, each one of them. And I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt. Thank you, Your Honor.
I honestly believe that this person, not even a person, this beast, deserved the ultimate punishment of death.
D'Angelo wasn't charged with dozens of other sexual assaults because the cases were too old to prosecute, but he confessed to them during his trial. D'Angelo was arrested in 2018 with a new method of DNA tracing. It is a day many families in California have waited for. Joseph D'Angelo now sentenced to multiple life terms in prison. Live in the newsroom, Amy Johnson, CBS 2 News. I'll send it back to you in the studio.
Yeah, many of those families and some of the victims there applauded as he was let out of that courtroom there. All right, Amy, thank you very much.
Joseph D'Angelo, the man known as the Golden State Killer, learned his fate today after a week of heartbreaking testimony from his victims. But is the serial killer really as frail as he appears to be in court? Prosecutors are now saying he's faking it.
Is the Golden State Killer faking that frail old man appearance? All this week, we've seen 74-year-old Joseph D'Angelo confined to a wheelchair.
All rise.
He sat disheveled and showed zero emotion as he listened to all those heartbreaking victim impact statements as woman after woman bravely faced him down.
He's a selfish, sadistic, calculating, cruel, pathetic piece of scum.
Michelle Cruz, whose sister Janelle was slain by D'Angelo in 1986, says his lack of reaction left her frustrated.
Didn't matter what I said, I don't think I got a reaction out of him. He just sat there and stared out.
Now prosecutors say D'Angelo is faking it. Sacramento District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert just released this video showing the monster springing up on a table in his cell to fix a light. Here, he's exercising, and here he's wiping the floor with a rag under his shoe.
Somebody said there's a method to his madness. And I think Mr. D'Angelo is very calculating and cunning and doing whatever he can, whatever's in his own best interest.
None of this comes as a surprise to D'Angelo's former fiancée, Bonnie Olson, who memorably stared him down in court earlier this week.
I think he's been acting for 60 years.
Today's hearing was held at a ballroom at Cal State Sacramento.
You would bow your heads.
When participants were asked to bow their heads in memory of his victims, D'Angelo kept staring straight ahead. He finally stood up, removed his mask, and spoke. This is the first time we've heard him utter a word since his arrest 2 years ago.
I've listened to all your statements, each one of them. And I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt.
He was sentenced to life for his 13-year campaign of 50 rapes and 13 murders.
We are adjourned.
D'Angelo's string of crimes began back in 1975 and lasted for 11 years. All week long, we've seen raw emotion in court as victims of the Golden State Killer have come face to face with the murderer in powerful victim impact statements. Well, today, the roll call of victims continued as they confront a man they say is a monster.
I just want to tell you, buddy, to rot in hell.
Raw emotion today as the Golden State Killer is confronted by his victims and their loved ones.
You are just one of those weak, powerless men who use their physical strength to hurt women.
They came forward to look 74-year-old Joseph D'Angelo in the eye.
He stole my innocence, my security, threatened my life, threatened the lives of my family.
I encountered pure evil when you awakened me and thrust me into a nightmare of fear and violence.
I see you for the monster that you are.
Gay Hardwick was sexually assaulted by D'Angelo 40 years ago. She had to be comforted as she spoke.
He ate from my refrigerator and he drank 2 beers while I lay bound and blindfolded unclothed and freezing on the hardwood floor in front of an open door in the cold March night.
She twisted a sheet of paper into a ball to represent the lives snuffed out by DeAngelo. Then it was the turn of her husband, who was also tied up at gunpoint by DeAngelo.
Joe Angelo is an animal of the worst kind.
This woman also confronted DeAngelo. She was once going to marry him until she broke off the engagement. She asked her close friend to speak on her behalf.
Even a gun pointed at her face could not make her choose you.
A victim's advocate spoke on behalf of a married couple.
For 42 years, we have lived with the memories of the night we were suddenly awakened by a man standing in our bedroom doorway, shouting orders with a flashlight and a gun in hand, threatening death if we resisted.
DeAngelo confessed in June to a catalog of horrendous crimes.
Murder in the first degree, how do you plead?
Guilty.
DeAngelo will be sentenced on Friday, but before that, he faces another day of damning confrontations like this.
If there was ever anyone more deserving of death, I can't imagine who.
By pleading guilty to 13 murders and more than 50 rapes, DeAngelo avoided the death penalty.
Mr. DeAngelo would like to make a brief statement.
DeAngelo?
I've listened to all your statements, each one of them. And I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, sir.
Joseph James DeAngelo, the former police officer known as the Golden Gate Killer, for his spree of rapes and murders across California in the 1970s and 80s, was sentenced Friday to 11 consecutive terms of life without parole. The punishment ensures that DeAngelo, 74, will die in prison for his crimes that terrified the Sacramento area, fear that lingered long after the killings stopped, as the case went cold for 40 years. As I listened to the survivors and I've watched you, I could not help but wonder what you're thinking, sentencing Judge Michael Bowman told DeAngelo. Are you capable of comprehending the pain and anguish you have caused? Wearing a white face mask, DeAngelo was expressionless during the hours-long hearing held in the ballroom of Sacramento State University amid the coronavirus pandemic. Before being officially sentenced, he took off his mask and stood up to address the court. I've listened to all your statements. Each one of them, a gaunt-looking DeAngelo said, appearing to choke up. He took a long pause before adding, and I'm really sorry to everyone I've hurt. Thank you, Your Honor. For decades, investigators hunted for the person responsible for the violent reign of terror across 6 California counties. DeAngelo, an Auburn police officer from 1976 to 1979, was nabbed in 2018 through DNA that investigators collected from a car door and a discarded piece of tissue paper. Survivors and their families who were present for the sentencing applauded as Bowman said DeAngelo didn't deserve any mercy, and again as the convicted serial killer was taken into custody and out of the room in a wheelchair. In June, DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder, involving rapes and burglaries dating back to the 1970s in a plea deal that spared him the death penalty. The court approves this plea, however the court is not saying that Mr. DeAngelo doesn't deserve to have the death penalty imposed, Bowman said. Mr. DeAngelo will spend the rest of his natural life and ultimately meet his death confined behind the walls of a state penitentiary. The sentencing capped a days-long hearing of victim impact statements, and fell on the 40th anniversary of 2 of the murders committed by DeAngelo. Those who gave victim impact statements included the woman who had been married to DeAngelo up until last year. Sharon Huddle, a Sacramento divorce lawyer, married D'Angelo in 1973, and the couple had 3 daughters. The pair separated in 1991 but remained married till 2019. Huddle broke her silence in the case in a statement to the court Thursday, in which she indicated that her husband would lie to her about where he was going at night, claiming he was working the late shift. "I live every day with post-traumatic distress," Huddle wrote, according to the Sacramento Bee.
Serial rapist and murderer Joseph D'Angelo, better known as the Golden State Killer, has been sentenced to life in prison without parole. The former police officer admitted to assaulting more than 50 women and murdering 13 people across California in the 1970s and 80s. Before sentencing, the 74-year-old apologised to his victims and their families.
I've listened to all your statements. Each one of them. And I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm Netta Iranpour. And I'm Stella Escobedo. Thanks so much for joining us. So the Golden State Killer formally learned his sentence for a crime spree spanning decades. He faced several of his victims, each of them delivering testimony. News 8's Chris Groh, he's been watching this closely. He joins us live now with...
And Joseph D'Angelo will face life in prison with no parole. He didn't say much of anything since he was arrested, didn't say anything throughout this trial, but today during his sentencing, he offered this.
I've listened to all your statements, each one of them. And I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt.
And the 74-year-old escaped being found for decades after committing a series of heinous crimes during the 70s and 80s. That crime spree, a nightmare for so many during those spanning that 11 counties from Sacramento to Orange County up and down California. Now, Joseph D'Angelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of murder and 13 counts of kidnapping and robbery related to rape. As part of that plea deal that he took, though, he also admitted guilt to dozens of rapes and sexual assaults. But the reason why prosecutors couldn't formally charge D'Angelo with them is because those crimes had basically their statutes of limitations had expired. Now, prosecutors one by one today, prior to the judge handing down this sentence, which was already agreed upon, laid out exactly what their defendants, essentially, the reasons that they were trying these cases, the victims' families, why this moment was so important for them, but also why these crimes were so heinous and why Joseph D'Angelo has been described as a monster.
We heard about the 13 lives that were cut short through murder. We heard of the memories that were never made. We heard of the dozens and dozens of sexual assault victims who had to go through that depraved act while some of their husbands watched.
And again, D'Angelo will spend life in prison without parole. The reason why he took this plea deal is so that he could avoid any type of death penalty. Back to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tanya Rivero. Thank you for joining us. The infamous Golden State Killer has been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
I've listened to all your statements, each one of them. And I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt.
74-year-old Joseph D'Angelo pleaded guilty to 13 murders and 13 rape-related charges across California. They happened between 1975 and 1986. D'Angelo is a former police officer. He also admitted to dozens more sexual assaults for which the statute of limitations had expired. Victims and their families got the chance to confront D'Angelo in court over the last few days.
The man known as the Golden State Killer was sentenced today to multiple life in prison sentences. Chris Martinez reports from Los Angeles.
The so-called Golden State Killer apologized just before a judge in Sacramento sentenced him to multiple life in prison terms without the possibility of parole.
And I'm really sorry to everyone I've hurt.
Joseph James D'Angelo pleaded guilty in June to 13 murders and 13 rape-related charges to avoid the death penalty. He also admitted to dozens of attacks and sexual assaults across 11 counties.
He really wanted to hurt as many people as he could, and he did just that.
D'Angelo, a former police officer, terrorized California residents from 1975 to 1986. He evaded arrest until 2018, when new DNA testing techniques helped track him down. Friday's sentencing followed several days of victim impact statements.
He's a selfish, sadistic, calculating, cruel, pathetic piece of scum.
Victims have asked that D'Angelo be sent to the toughest prison possible, with no considerations made for his advanced age. Chris Martinez, CBS News, Los Angeles.
We begin tonight with new information on how investigators tracked down the suspected Golden State Killer case. Good evening. I'm Dan Ashley.
And I'm Kristen Z. Sacramento County prosecutors today confirmed that investigators tracked Joseph D'Angelo down with help from genealogy websites that contain genetic information of a relative of his.
Deputy DA Steve Grippy told the Sacramento Bee that investigators painstakingly compared DNA collected at a crime scene years ago to genetic profiles on various websites.
They then followed clues to individuals in the family trees to determine whether they were potential suspects. According to the Bee, the process came to fruition last Thursday when investigators realized D'Angelo might be a suspect.
Now, they set up surveillance on D'Angelo and obtained his DNA from something he threw away. Got a DNA match on Monday and then arrested him Tuesday night.
Police say D'Angelo struck fear in the hearts of people from Sacramento to San Francisco to Los Angeles for more than a decade.
With a key break in the Golden State Killer case, inside this small house, a free DNA sharing company had no idea it was used to track a serial killer. The arrest is raising new questions about the power of these genealogy websites.
You take DNA tests to learn about your family tree, but you could be unleashing much more information. KPX 5's Julie Watts is taking a closer look at these privacy concerns for us. Jules?
That's right. Now, authorities say that they did search actually several public genealogy sites. Those are the ones that let you upload a file from DNA process somewhere else, and then you upload it to the public site and you can search their site for family matches. No search warrant was needed by authorities. It's all public information. MyHeritage and Ancestry are a couple of the big names, but investigators say the breakthrough came from GEDmatch.
Behind this white picket fence, on this quiet residential street in Lake Worth, Florida, lies the key to decode an unknown number of crimes. This is the home of GEDmatch. Investigators say the genealogy website helped them capture who they say is the elusive Golden State Killer, decades after his last murder. While you might expect a lab or a server farm, GEDmatch is a small operation run out of this one-room home office by this man. Curtis Rogers didn't want to be interviewed, but allowed a photographer to shoot this video. GEDmatch is an open-source, free genealogy website, largely run by users and volunteers and funded by donations. Unlike Ancestry and 23andMe, GEDmatch doesn't process DNA samples. Instead, users upload their results from those other sites and then search GEDmatch's larger pool of possible relatives. But while the website was created for genealogical research, a disclaimer notes it can't guarantee users will not find other uses, which is exactly what investigators did. Uploading the DNA data of a sample taken from a crime scene years ago, They searched GEDmatch for people who shared genes with the Golden State Killer. Turns out someone related to D'Angelo took an ancestry test at some point, and their information ended up in the database. By researching that person's family tree, investigators could narrow down which relatives fit the description of the killer. In response, GEDmatch posted this warning today. While the database was created for genealogical research, it's important that GEDmatch participants understand the possible uses of their DNA, including identification of relatives that have committed crimes.
Now, users can ask to have their information deleted from GEDmatch, and this isn't the first time a crime was solved with family DNA searches. Bottom line, it doesn't matter if you've ever taken an ancestry test. If any of your relatives have and made the information public, they could actually use it to identify you.
Yeah, clearly a lot of privacy concerns. But this it's not foolproof, is it? Not exact science.
No, and actually investigators in this case did learn that the hard way. We found out today investigators actually misidentified a 73-year-old Oregon man as a possible suspect in the Golden State killings last year. They were using the same genetic profiling methods. They say that man exhibited a rare genetic marker also found in D'Angelo's DNA. In this case, they said they got a confirming DNA sample from outside D'Angelo's home, presumably garbage, and that actually does not require a search warrant. So basically, most of the work they did here wouldn't require any sort of search warrant.
Public, right? Yeah.
Public information, it's everywhere.
Thanks,
It's crazy.
Julie.
We're learning that a tissue and a car door handle helped to crack one of the biggest murder mysteries in California history. Nightbeat's Katie Nielsen is here with new revelations in the case. Katie?
Melissa, late tonight, the judge unsealed a search warrant and an arrest warrant in the case. It took detectives more than 40 years to nab their prime suspect. Tonight, we know how they finally got him.
These are the almost 200 pages of redacted court documents outlining how investigators built their case against suspected Golden State Killer Joseph D'Angelo.
He knows they have, DNA because he left DNA. But at the time, not a big deal.
Fast forward to today. DNA evidence is the backbone of the case against D'Angelo. Court documents reveal detectives started closing in when they followed D'Angelo to a Hobby Lobby store in Roseville on April 18th. A swab was collected from the door handle while D'Angelo was inside the store. According to court documents, that sample matched DNA found at the scene of the March 1980 murders of a couple in Ventura County. A few days later, on April 23rd, investigators collected samples from the trash D'Angelo put on the curb at his Citrus Heights home. They found a piece of tissue containing DNA they say also matched that crime scene.
As long as the evidence was preserved, it's allowing us to go back and solve crimes that were committed long ago.
D'Angelo is accused of at least 12 murders, dozens of sexual assaults, and more than 100 burglaries. The documents list hundreds of items detectives think D'Angelo collected from his victims, often personal items like wedding or class rings, or even undergarments.
It's sick, it's twisted, but he took it as a trophy. He wanted to have something probably to remember his victims by.
D'Angelo was arrested the day after investigators got a positive DNA match from the tissue found in the trash. On the Night Beat, I'm Katie Nielsen.
The alleged Golden State Killer who terrorized California in the 70s and 80s makes his first court appearance. Clad in an orange jumpsuit, 72-year-old Joseph James D'Angelo went before a judge in a Sacramento courtroom in a wheelchair. He was arraigned on charges he killed a couple in Sacramento County in 1978. D'Angelo did not enter a plea. Prosecutors now say D'Angelo could be responsible for a 13th murder. He's also suspected in the rapes of dozens of women and hundreds of burglaries.
Detectives used DNA to finally track down D'Angelo, but not before the technology led them to the wrong man.
Nicole Brewer is here now with what the case means for your genetic privacy. Nicole.
Well, hi, Yuki and Jess. We learned today that back in March of 2017, investigators misidentified an elderly Oregon man as a possible suspect. He wasn't their guy, but on Tuesday, police arrested a man they say is responsible for at least a dozen killings and 50 rapes.
While executing a violent crime spree across California in the 70s and 80s, the Golden State Killer covered up his face and his fingerprints, but left behind his genetic code.
I believe very strongly that it's the greatest tool ever given to law enforcement.
Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert led a team of investigators to track down the suspect, a 72-year-old ex-police officer arrested on Tuesday.
I thought it was crazy. I mean, you know, them finding like a guy like 40 years later.
I'm pretty glad that they were able to ascertain who it was.
Turns out investigators created a genetic profile from decades-old crime scene data, then searched a public genealogy website called gedmatch.com to find distant relatives.
Interesting? Yes, but I think it brings up a whole bunch of legal questions.
Like the privacy of people who use ancestry kits without realizing they're signing up to potentially become involuntary informants.
I think in some cases it's okay to sacrifice elements of privacy in order to protect people.
If they know it's a public site, then they know the risk and they should be okay with it.
Free and open to the public, GEDmatch allows people to upload their DNA profiles from companies like Ancestry.com and 23andMe to expand their search for relatives. And while the commercial companies require a court order to obtain DNA, some say they'll think twice before completing one of their kits.
It does raise the question, if it can be used for this, what else can it be used for?
I kind of worry about what the implications are.
Now, GEDmatch says it has always informed users that the database could be used for law enforcement purposes as stated in the site policy. But if users have concerns, they can remove their DNA from that site or refrain from uploading it in the first place.
Back in the 70s and 80s, a man known as the Golden State Killer terrorized California, committing a string of more than 100 burglaries, 45 rapes, and a dozen murders. Definitely a bad dude. Even though police had DNA evidence from crime scenes, it never matched any DNA records on file, so the case went cold. Until last week. By this point, you've probably heard about this man's capture, but you might not realize that the science used to crack the case is totally different from standard DNA forensics. So by understanding how DNA analysis is typically done for crime scenes, we can dive into why the Golden State Killer case is so special. Usually, forensic scientists process DNA with a method called short tandem repeat, or STR, analysis. The basic idea is that little stretches of short repeated sequences, like TAGA, are scattered throughout your genome in specific places on specific chromosomes. Because the number of repeats at each location tends to vary from person to person, counting them can be useful. Like, they can help match the semen in a rape kit to a suspect. For instance, you might have 6 TAGA repeats on a chromosome that you got from one parent and 10 repeats from your other parent, while I might have 12 and 15. Now, if the number of repeats at one spot in someone's DNA happens to match evidence from a crime scene, that doesn't necessarily mean much. But if you look at a bunch of repeats and they all match, you might be onto something. In the US, forensic scientists have traditionally tested for repeats at 13 different spots in the genome, although recently they upped it to 20. That's what's happening when you hear about hits in CODIS, the FBI's database of DNA records. A match is all about probability, and there are a lot of factors to consider, like how common certain STRs are in a given population. But if your suspect's DNA repeats in the same 13 ways as a sample from the crime scene, the odds that the suspect isn't the source are typically about 1 in a billion. In other words, combined with other evidence, you can be pretty confident that you've got the right person. Of course, DNA analysis isn't perfect. Contamination is a concern, and there's room for doubt in cases where there's a small amount of DNA or the DNA is degraded. These days, standard STR analysis uses a process called PCR to amplify the DNA sections the police are interested in. But that can lead to errors, and they might not get solid data for all 20 repeat locations. Another challenge is that many samples include DNA from multiple people, like both a victim and the criminal, making the analysis more complicated. And any positive match still needs to be interpreted. After all, an innocent person might have scraped their finger and left a few drops of blood behind at a future crime scene. So that's how standard forensic DNA testing works, and if it's all done right, it can be really persuasive, as you probably know from shows like CSI. But with the Golden State Killer, the cold case heated up because of a different approach to DNA, one that's a lot closer to spitting in a tube to find out your ancestry. Detectives had some DNA evidence that was collected from a double murder in 1980 and frozen, so it was especially well preserved. We don't know the specifics of what they did next, but they eventually uploaded data from that sample onto an open source genealogy website called GEDmatch. While GEDmatch isn't isn't a power player in the commercial DNA industry like 23andMe or Ancestry.com, it runs on the same kind of information. So someone might use one of those services to get raw genome data, then submit it to GED Match to help find long-lost relatives and piece together their family trees. The FBI created the DNA profile of the Golden State Killer in their own labs from that well-preserved sample, and they probably generated the same kind of data by looking for single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. These are individual A's, T's, G's, and C's throughout the genome that we know vary between people and can be passed down from parents to kids. And because of that, they're useful biological markers. In a way, SNP analysis is similar to STR analysis, except it's cheap and easy to test for tens of thousands of these puppies at once. So that's what's going on when you mail in your DNA. Most companies aren't directly sequencing your entire genome. Instead, they're using technology that checks your DNA for a whole bunch of SNPs. Most importantly for detectives, because there are so many SNPs and they change less over time from mutation, SNP testing is much better than STR analysis when it comes to identifying far-flung relatives. So once the detectives on the Golden State Killer case uploaded the genetic profile of their suspect, they looked for similarities among GED Match's 900,000 other profiles. Their killer hadn't uploaded his own data, but some of his distant relatives, like third and fourth cousins, had. These are people who would share about 2% of their DNA with him at most, but it was enough of a lead to build potential family trees, some 25 in all. Within 4 months of getting some initial hits on the genealogy site, police officers had painstakingly narrowed their focus from thousands of relatives to one man. He was the right age and had lived in California during the crime spree. To confirm that he was the Golden State Killer, they needed some of his DNA to test for a match. So they put him under surveillance and grabbed his trash. They used something with some of his cells on it, maybe a straw, soda can, or used Kleenex. We don't know what exactly. And then they did a DNA test, probably STR analysis, and got a match. Just to be sure, they checked again. Another garbage item, another test, and another match. After 44 years, they had identified the Golden State Killer. He was a former cop named Joseph James D'Angelo, now age 72, and living in a suburb of Sacramento, California. Now, this case isn't the only time DNA has been used like this, but it's one of the highest profile cases, and it's likely to have people talking for a while, especially about data privacy issues. We won't get into that here, but it's definitely something people are thinking more about, as investigators realize how many ways they might be able to use DNA. Even if it involves way more work than TV crime dramas ever show. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow News. If you want to learn more about forensics, you can check out our episode that dives into a lot more crime scene science. And if you want to just keep thinking about the world more complexly with us, you can go to youtube.com/scishow and subscribe.
A decades-old cold case reveals an ex-cop to be a suspected serial killer.
The FBI and California law enforcement officials say they have arrested the Golden State Killer. His youngest victim is talking tonight about how she survived his attack. Chris Martinez has more from Los Angeles.
Neighbors were shocked as FBI agents searched the home of 72-year-old Joseph James D'Angelo.
It's kind of crazy, really, because I live right behind him.
Authorities say D'Angelo is the Golden State Killer, also dubbed Original Night Stalker, wanted for a string of gruesome rapes and murders spanning from 1976 to 1986.
We were able to get some discarded DNA, and we were able to confirm what we thought we already knew, that we had our man.
This is like the greatest gift ever.
Margaret Wardlow was just 13 years old when she became the serial rapist's youngest victim.
He'd ask, like, do you want me to kill your mother? In a harsh whisper. I said, I don't care. And as soon as you started answering, he'd say, shut up, shut up, shut up.
Wardlow says her defiance came from reading up on the case and what she believed he was after: power.
And I just knew if I stood up to him as much as I could, I knew he'd leave sooner rather than later.
Wardlow and other victims say D'Angelo's capture is one step closer to justice. Authorities say the killer's DNA and crime pattern is linked to at least 45 rapes, a dozen murders, and more than 120 home burglaries from Sacramento to Southern California. Chris Martinez, CBS News.
Authorities say D'Angelo served as a police officer for 2 California cities in the 1970s, possibly while committing some of the crimes.
Police tracked down a suspect in the so-called Golden State Killer case using a genealogy website and discarded DNA. Investigators flagged 72-year-old suspect Joseph James D'Angelo after matching his relatives' DNA available online to samples found at some of the crime scenes. Police then surveilled D'Angelo and gathered 2 discarded samples of his own genetic material. D'Angelo's DNA was a match to DNA collected at the scenes of several of the decades-old murders. The Golden State Killer, also known as the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker, terrorized California in the 1970s and 80s and is believed to be behind dozens of rapes and at least 12 murders. D'Angelo will be arraigned Friday on 2 murder charges, and more charges are expected.
Show. I'm Megyn Kelly, and we begin today in a major break. We have a major break and a very cold case that we've been following here at Megyn Kelly Today. We first brought you the story of the notorious Golden State Killer last month, and boy, has it taken a turn. Police say after 30-plus years, they have their man. More now from NBC's Joe Fryer.
A notorious cold case finally cracked. Police believe a ruthless serial killer is now behind bars. Known both as the Golden State Killer and the East Area Rapist, investigators say their suspect committed at least 12 murders and more than 50 rapes across California in the 1970s and 80s.
We were looking for a needle in a haystack, but we also all knew that the needle was there.
Joseph James D'Angelo was arrested Tuesday night in Sacramento, just 10 miles from where the serial attacks began more than 40 years ago. 2 of the victims he's accused of killing, Bruce Harrington's brother and sister-in-law, who were bludgeoned to death in their home in 1980.
It is time for the victims to begin to heal.
Police said thousands of man-hours and detective work helped them zero in on D'Angelo, and DNA samples from D'Angelo provided the final piece of evidence.
We were able to get some discarded DNA, and we were able to confirm what we thought we already knew, that we had our man.
D'Angelo had been a police officer in the nearby town of Auburn. He was fired after shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent from a store in 1979. Now 72, D'Angelo was on a police force when the crime spree began, eventually spreading to 10 counties. Investigators say the killer's brutal attacks included sadistic touches like stealing personal items from his victims and terrorizing some survivors again with threatening phone messages. The case's profile had risen in recent years, thanks in part to the work of journalist Michelle McNamara, who died in her sleep in 2016. McNamara's best-selling book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, was finished with the help of her husband, actor Patton Oswalt, who appeared on Late Night with Seth Meyers.
He's caught. The bracelets are on, and it feels like this thing that she wanted so badly is now done.
Wow. For more on how police finally cracked the case, I am joined by Sacramento County District Attorney Anne-Marie Schubert. Anne-Marie, thank you so much for being here, and congratulations on finally making an arrest in this case. So what was the tip? What was the moment that cracked this case wide open?
Well, I wouldn't say it was a tip from a person. I would say that it was DNA. Honestly, it was passion, persistence, and DNA. It was using innovative DNA techniques to get to the path that we needed in a very short order, which was all in the last week.
But the DNA, so you said yesterday that this guy wasn't even on your radar except for the last 6 days, and he was never on the radar prior to that. So there had to be something that led you to check that discarded DNA within the past 6 days.
Right. It had to do with the way that the DNA was done in this particular case, which was innovative, really the most advanced way that we can do DNA now, and it's something that ultimately led us to this individual.
But when you say discarded DNA, help us understand what that means.
Well, that means that the Sheriff's Department put him under surveillance, and he left some DNA, abandoned some DNA, and they used that to then build from, and then a secondary sample was obtained from him. And that was really the ultimate piece of evidence that identified him through his DNA as the East Area Rapist Golden State Killer.
But why did they put him under surveillance?
Because the technology that we used using DNA led us to him as a potential suspect in this case.
So his DNA was in the system in some way?
No, his DNA was not in a criminal database, I would say it that way.
Is it because he was in law enforcement?
It's, you know, I would say this, because I know everybody has questions about DNA. The arrest warrant is under seal, and the mechanism of the DNA will eventually come out, but as I say, it's really some innovative DNA work that led to him being a suspect, and then the sample ultimately, which identified him through his DNA.
Fascinating. I understand you. There's only so much you can reveal, so I appreciate you trying to thread that needle. I get it.
Right.
Did he make any sort of a mistake or a slip up recently? I mean, did that play any role?
No. This man was undetected for 42 years until 6 days ago.
How was he able to hide in plain sight? Because he's living in, it's Citrus Hills, right? The same
Citrus Heights.
Citrus Heights, the same place where he committed some of his murders.
You know, he obviously was very good at what he did.
Wow. First of all, has he lawyered up?
I can't answer the question. I don't know the answer to that. He has not yet been arraigned. He'll be arraigned tomorrow.
Is he talking?
That's a question you'll need to ask the Sheriff's Department.
What was I know you said publicly he was surprised on arrest. Can you describe what that means?
Well, the sheriff described it. I wasn't there, obviously, when he was arrested, but I just believe that he was taken by surprise, and I'm quite sure did not know it was coming.
He was living with whom when he was arrested?
I don't know the answer to that. I do know that when they apprehended him, he was by himself.
By himself, okay. And for the 6 days that you all were observing him, can you give us any color on that? What you saw, whether you were concerned at all? What did you observe?
Well, I wasn't part of the surveillance. Obviously, I knew about what was going on. I think, you know, from a perspective of public safety, that was a big concern, is making sure that however this went down, that everybody was safe, and make sure that it was done in a swift and safe manner, really.
So for 10 years, it's believed this guy was on a killing spree from 76 to 86 and committing over 45 rapes. Do you believe, because as of 1986, they believe it stopped. Do you believe that? Do you believe he stopped killing as of 1986?
Well, I know that at least here in California with our DNA data bank that we don't know of any other murders in California, but that doesn't, you know, I'm not sure we're ever going to know all of them. I mean, because some may not have DNA, some may be in other places, some may not have, be in the system. So I'm not sure we're ever going to know, but what we do know is what we know now, which is he's the East Area rapist and he's the Golden State Killer.
How closely do you believe, because this case was quiet for so many years, and then Michelle McNamara wrote her book, and law enforcement's always been interested in it. CNN headline news profiled him in an hour-long special not long ago. We put the case on our show about a month ago. What was it, do you think, that led to the renewed interest in this?
Well, I think the press conference that was done in 2016 really reinvigorated folks. And after that press conference, you know, I asked a lot of folks to come to Sacramento and make a commitment of resources and people and experience and knowledge and dedication. And we did that. And I think everybody felt we can do this if we work hard enough and we are persistent and passionate about it. And you know, it all culminated yesterday.
There was a $50,000 reward. That was one of the things you guys offered as of 2016 to anybody giving information that would lead to his arrest or capture. Is that going to anybody?
That's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that yet. I don't think people have sat down and tried to figure out whether that should happen in this case. But I'm sure it will be discussed.
It's possible.
It's possible.
How closely do you believe the sketches? Because you guys put out sketches of this guy. Now, seeing who you arrested, this guy D'Angelo, how closely do you think he resembled those sketches?
I think the sketches are the sketches. I think the DNA is what really this case is all about. I mean,
and there's no doubt in your mind.
Over time.
There's no doubt, based on that DNA, there's no doubt in your mind you have the right guy.
There's no doubt in my mind that we have the right guy, yes.
Can I just ask you, because one of the things that you thought, and many people thought, was that he might be former law enforcement. The way he broke into the women's houses and the couples' houses, the way he knew how to tie up people. He knew just how to cover his tracks very well. Was there any investigation at the time or thereafter of fired police officers? Because he worked for 6 years as a cop. He got fired after he was caught shoplifting. He was stole dog repellent and I think a rope. So at the time, did anybody say, let's take a look at cops who have been fired who might be disgruntled in the area?
I don't know if they looked at that. I'm not sure they would know based on basically personnel records where somebody was actually fired. So that would be a difficult one. Being a member of law enforcement and actually being a member of the military was always something that law enforcement considered as a possibility.
Wow. Now he's been charged with 8 murders. Do you expect that number to go up?
He's been charged right now, Megan, with 4. I expect those numbers to go up because there's many other counties involved.
Yeah, well, we were told 4 in your county and 4 in another as of this morning, at least according to the LA Times.
Yeah, well, it's 2 in Sacramento and 2 in Ventura, but there'll be other cases filed from other counties as well.
Wow. Anne-Marie, thank you. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
I mean, it's a
Thanks for having
testament
me
to
on.
the dogged law enforcement efforts. Eventually, they got their man. All the best, and we'll continue to follow it.
Hello, Today fans. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking that button down there and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives.
Well, brand new information tonight about the role a Florida company played in taking down the man suspected of being the Golden State Killer.
ABC Action News reporter Michael Paluska shows us how the new DNA business's website cracked the decades-old case.
Suspected serial killer Joseph DeAngelo eluding capture for decades, finally taken down by an unsuspecting relative who uploaded their DNA to GetMatch.com. Investigators finding a family connection to DeAngelo's DNA, then meticulously working their way through his family tree.
It's not surprising that they can do that.
Kelsey Henschel-Fay is a forensic anthropologist at USF. She does the same thing investigators did to track DeAngelo down, only her research identifies human remains.
Is it possible that this is your guy?
And she can only access law enforcement databases, but as more sites like GetMatch start up, it gives her hope.
The longer it goes with this person being unidentified, the more unlikely it is that they will be identified.
GetMatch posting today, quote, "They were not approached by law enforcement or anyone else about this case or about the DNA," then giving the disclaimer that their policy states the DNA can be used for other purposes, quote, including identification of relatives that have committed crimes or were victims of crimes. So this is my DNA profile. It says confidence extremely high. That is matching me to my twin brother. So even if I didn't give my DNA, they could probably track me down using his information. But the lab experts here say they wish they had access to this type of information.
It would be very nice if we could do that. Be able to utilize more of the DNA databases and the genealogy to be able to try and track down who these unidentifieds are.
In Tampa, Michael Paluska, ABC Action News.
We begin with a very serious story where investigators in California say DNA evidence led them to one of the country's most notorious serial killers. Former police officer Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested yesterday, and he is believed to be the so-called Golden State Killer.
That elusive predator is accused of about 50 rapes and 12 murders, crimes that terrorized California in the 1970s and 80s. John Blackstone is outside DeAngelo's home in Citrus Heights near Sacramento, where the suspect was taken into custody. John, good morning. This is quite a story.
It is, and good morning. And as you can see, investigators are still pouring through this home here looking for evidence. 2 years ago, a law enforcement task force jump-started new efforts to catch the Golden State Killer, and the big break came only a few days ago in the form of advanced new DNA technology.
And all of a sudden, in a 6-day period of time, we've solved the case of the century.
Sacramento District Attorney Anne-Marie Schubert made the stunning announcement on Wednesday.
We found the needle in the haystack, and it was right here in Sacramento.
Police say Joseph James DeAngelo is the Golden State Killer who terrorized Californians during a harrowing crime spree that began over 40 years ago.
We started some surveillance. We were able to get some discarded DNA, and we were able to confirm what we thought we already knew, that we had our man.
DeAngelo is an ex-police officer who became a suspect in the last week, identified using what authorities would only describe as a sophisticated new kind of DNA technology. The 72-year-old D'Angelo has been charged with 8 murders in Sacramento, Orange, and Ventura counties, but is suspected in several other killings and dozens of rapes. Many of the crimes were committed just miles from his home in Citrus Heights, where he was arrested on Tuesday. In the past year, a special episode of 48 Hours helped keep the case in the public eye, as well as a best-selling book written by Michelle McNamara, the late wife of comedian Patton Oswalt, who praised his wife last night.
Her book and the article that led to the book really amped up all the interest in the case and really put a lot of focus on this.
The Golden State Killer hunted and haunted his victims from 1974 to 1986, raping women while their husbands or boyfriends were tied up nearby. He even took souvenirs of his crimes and made frightening phone calls to survivors. Bruce Harrington's brother and sister-in-law were 2 of the alleged victims.
For the 51 ladies who were brutally raped in this crime scene, sleep better tonight. He isn't coming through the window.
Linda Odell is one of those women raped by the Golden State Killer in 1977. Deputy Carol Daly took her to the hospital.
We just didn't give up. No, and we're just so pleased that this is over.
D'Angelo worked for 27 years in a local supermarket warehouse. He just retired. He was an officer in 2 California police departments back in the 1970s. Investigators are trying to determine if he committed any of his crimes while he was on duty as a police officer, or whether his knowledge of police work helped him evade capture for all these years. He will be arraigned on Friday. John?
John, thanks. What an amazing story.
Investigators used publicly shared DNA data to track down the suspected Golden State Killer decades after his crime spree. 72-year-old James D'Angelo appeared in court Friday. He's suspected of committing at least 12 murders, more than 50 rapes, and staging hundreds of break-ins going back to the 1970s. John Blackstone has more on how police found him.
Handcuffed to a wheelchair, Joseph D'Angelo was arraigned on charges for 2 murders in 1978. He was barely audible answering the judge. Investigators found D'Angelo using DNA from crime scenes decades ago, which they submitted to a publicly shared genealogy website called GEDmatch. Cold case investigator Paul Holes.
We were able to do this without seeking the legal authority in terms of getting the federal grand jury subpoena or the search warrant that we would need if we wanted to search the other types of genealogy sites.
GEDmatch users submit DNA profiles they buy from sites like Ancestry.com and 23andMe. They plug their data for free into GEDmatch, searching for distant relatives. Within days, investigators found distant cousins of the suspected Golden State Killer.
We literally went back to the great-great-great-grandfather with individuals that were born in the early part of the 1800s.
It took 4 months to identify D'Angelo as a likely suspect, but to prove it, investigators followed him to collect his DNA from something he threw away. District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert.
It could be he left a tissue. It could be that he, put his hands on a door handle, but it was what I call abandoned DNA.
That abandoned DNA solved a 44-year-old mystery in 4 months, but also raises concerns about the privacy of DNA collection. Isn't it almost certain that a defense attorney is going to call this an illegal search?
We would expect that. We anticipate it. We're fully prepared to deal with that through the court process.
GEDmatch says law enforcement never approached them. In a statement, GEDmatch tells users if you are concerned about non-genealogical uses of your DNA, you should not upload your DNA to the database. Brooke?
John Blackstone, thanks. Privacy lawyer Joel Winston joins me now from Pittsburgh for more on this. So, Joel, law enforcement says they were able to link this DNA using an open source, publicly shared website, GEDmatch. But the question, so first, maybe user beware if you're going to go to an open source site like that. But beyond that, for people who have used Ancestry.com or 23andMe, do we think law enforcement would have been able to dig through those databases the same way?
We do not. Ancestry.com and 23andMe have much more stringent privacy protections when it comes to legal enforcement and subpoenas, as well as search warrants. The open source website was essentially a Wikipedia of shared DNA and genealogy information among people who already had their DNA analyzed by one of these bigger companies, downloaded the raw data, and then uploaded it to a separate site.
So law enforcement brings a search warrant to Ancestry.com and they say, no, sorry, we won't give you the info?
If it is a valid search warrant that complies with the requirements of Ancestry.com, they will honor the search warrant. 23andMe has a similar policy. They state that they will strenuously refuse any search warrant requests, but ultimately, if they're legally compelled to comply, they will be required to turn over user data.
So in John Blackstone's piece, we saw the defense attorneys already saying this may be an illegal search. Do we have a sense of how courts are going to rule on those type of questions?
This is a really interesting situation because essentially they used the information from the crime scene and they took the raw data and uploaded it to this open source website and used portions of the information to match it to other individuals, a so-called family match. And through that, they were able to assemble a sort of a family tree of suspects and then individually pursue those portions of the family tree that they thought were the most likely. They were looking for a male. They knew that from the DNA evidence. And then they were looking for somebody who lived in the particular geographic area where the crimes were committed. So from that, they identified a main suspect, and then they followed this individual, and they were able to recover some of his personal DNA that he disposed of. We're not quite sure what it is. It could possibly be you touch your hand on a door, you get your hair cut, you sneeze and throw it away in a public garbage can. There are any number of ways that they could have acquired what is abandoned DNA from the suspect and then matched it up to the DNA from the crime scene.
So this is an important point. You don't necessarily have to take a DNA test yourself. If your brother or your mom or maybe even your cousin took it, it could be enough to learn something about you. And now for those of us who aren't committing murder, good, that's a good first step. But there are questions that you've outlined in the past over, could this data be used, say, to set rates for insurance? What are those concerns?
There are a number of concerns around the types of entities that can access this information. Currently, some federal laws protect your genetic information from insurance companies and from employers, as well as credit companies. But it's not guaranteed in the future. The laws could change, or different types of information could become known to you that you would have to turn over to these insurance companies. So realistically, the problem is that even if you protect your private information, it may be one of your family members that gives away your private information, or possibly if you've taken one of these DNA test kits, you may have already given away the privacy of your great-great-grandchildren.
Wow. Okay, a lot to think about. Joel Winston in Pittsburgh, thanks for talking us through some of it.
Thank you.
An Alabama man is expected to appear in court today after new DNA technology linked him to a decades-old double murder case. 45-year-old Coley McRaney faces charges in the 1999 killings of two high school students, Tracy Hallett and J.B. Beasley. Investigators used the same technique that led to the arrest of the alleged Golden State Killer. Omar Villafranca is here at the table. That's a rare thing for us, to show us how cracking dozens of cold cases, how that's working. This new technology, Omar, is really fascinating.
It is. Have any of you ever taken a home DNA test?
Yes.
No, I haven't.
Okay. Well, if
is that what you mean by spitting into the thing?
And
Yeah,
sending
like a
it in?
23andMe thing?
Yeah. If you do, you have the option of submitting your information to a public database. It's called GEDmatch. Now, hundreds of police departments are using a combination of GEDmatch and crime scene DNA to track down family members of possible suspects.
I wake up and I hear her screaming.
Carol Roberts says she's had countless dreams about her daughter, Tracy Hallett. Hallett and J.B. Beasley were 17 when they got lost on this Ozark, Alabama road in 1999. A memorial marks where their bodies were found in the trunk of Beasley's car. They had been shot.
We haven't slept all night in almost 20 years. I don't care how many times a night I wake up, Tracy's on my mind.
I remember like yesterday where I was when I got the phone call about this case.
It also stayed on the mind of Marlos Walker, now Ozark's police chief. A few months ago, he decided to see if old evidence might lead to a new break in the case.
What made you say, let me see if there's any DNA that we can process in this case?
What really struck a heart with me is when the Golden State Killer got caught, and I just thought that why not try to apply that to this case.
Alleged Golden State killer Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested in 2018 after DNA tied him to a series of decades-old rapes and murders. Inspired by that case, Chief Walker submitted the Ozark evidence to Virginia-based Parabon Nanolabs to help find the suspect. Parabon developed a genetic profile of a suspect and then ran that information through a public DNA database called GEDmatch. Parabon then created a possible family tree. And within months, Chief Walker had several new leads. Walker called in who he thought was a family member of a potential suspect.
You told him I need a sample of your DNA, and he gave you a sample.
Yes.
And you sent that back to the company. What did it come back with?
It come back with a positive hit.
When they told you it was a match, what was your reaction?
I just sit in my office in my chair, just thinking the day's finally come. And then I was also surprised of who it was. The young man has no criminal histories or anything.
Last month, police arrested 45-year-old Coley McCraney. McCraney's attorney says his client is not guilty.
Over 200 agencies have reached out to Parabon and asked us to analyze their cases.
Cece Moore is the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon and worked on the Ozark case. Parabon has helped solve nearly 50 cold cases. Moore says the company's work generates leads.
We're providing a highly scientific tip, but no one's going to be arrested based on what we say alone. Law enforcement has to take that tip and then go and build their traditional forensic case against this person.
Carol Roberts is still praying for justice.
All I've ever wanted to do was stand in front of someone one day and ask them why. Why you thought you had the right to take my daughter's life.
You may get that day. Are you ready?
I think the Lord will give me the strength to be ready.
McCraney could face the death penalty. Now, this type of DNA evidence has not been challenged in a trial yet. The first case, which is not in Alabama, it's actually going to be in Washington State, expected to be tried in June. And I talked to a forensic expert who expects defense attorneys to not only challenge the crime scene DNA and that integrity, but also the proprietary methods that Parabon uses to come up with the leads. And this expert also told me basically judges and lawyers are not scientists. We have to see how it plays out in court. What works in a lab may not work in a courtroom.
I'm surprised he would give up his DNA, Omar, knowing that he could possibly be tied to this case.
What's interesting is that the police chief said he recognized that name because he went to high school with that guy.
Wow.
So 6 degrees.
And he's trying to get a family tree connection, maybe.
And he got the root.
Wow.
Thank you. Really interesting.
The break in the Golden State Killer case would come on this website, gedmatch.com. That's according to a longtime cold case investigator assigned to hunting the man we now know is Joseph DeAngelo. gedmatch.com allows users to enter genetic data from other DNA testing sites in order to find potential family members. Cold case investigators believe one of DeAngelo's relatives likely entered their genetic information here, and when detectives entered DNA information from the Golden State Killer's crime scenes, they also found a partial match. From there, detectives scoured family trees to find DeAngelo. Forensic DNA expert Monty Miller says DNA evidence collected from the killer's crime scenes decades ago was key to this case, even if detectives back then didn't even realize they were preserving DNA evidence.
At the time, they didn't know how valuable some of that would be. They collected just because it has evidence on it, or they collected for other reasons. Back then, they didn't have any idea that we were going to be running DNA, but some of that evidence is still useful today.
Miller says ancestry websites offer law enforcement a whole new level of options.
Genealogy websites that they can go to now run DNA in a way that's designed to look for family members. The databases that they have oftentimes have many, many people that wouldn't be in the criminal database.
DeAngelo's alleged victims will get their first look at him in decades when he appears in court tomorrow afternoon. We will also be there. In the newsroom, I'm Tom Waite, KCAL 9 News.
And back now to our continuing coverage of an arrest in the case of the Golden State Killer. Investigators credited DNA with being the deciding piece of evidence to crack this case. And joining us now to talk more about how this may have happened and the challenges in such investigations is DNA legal consultant Bicca Barlow. Bicca, thank you so much for joining us.
No problem.
So as we heard, the Sacramento District Attorney said that after 40 years, the DNA helped solve this case in the last 6 days after police actually collected evidence from the suspect before he was arrested. In your experience, what does this sound like actually happened? This is very fascinating for people at home.
Well, I don't want to speculate,
Right.
and I know just as much as everybody else does, but it sounds to me as if the gentleman who was arrested was not in the state database, and that the laboratory somehow knew who he was, or the police, and went to pick up something he left behind and use that as a DNA sample. That's just speculation.
Right. Okay, but that does make some sense. So 40 years, though, I mean, that seems like a long time. Is this on the longer end for making sort of a DNA match?
It is, but it's not unheard of. This is not unusual, actually.
Okay. How, we've had the DNA database, it's starting to shrink a little bit. We've heard reports about that. Can you talk a little bit about how it's harder to solve cold cases because not as much DNA is being collected from criminals, but you aren't necessarily for an expanded database?
Well, I don't actually think it's correct that the database is shrinking.
Okay.
The speed at which it's growing has slowed.
Okay.
But it's always expanding, and it's getting close to 3 million people now. Wow. And, having a database can be useful for certain types of crimes, but it presumes that the person who committed the crime is actually in the database.
Right.
And that's not always true.
Okay.
So.
And we don't know specifically exactly how long before his arrest they collected his DNA, but it sounds like it may have been fairly recently. We're always hearing about all these backlogs. I mean, how could it have even happened so quickly that they made that match?
Well, once you have the profile of the individual from the evidence from a crime, it sits there in static, right? It is there. And so all you need is the person to compare it to at that point. So making the comparison, depending on the type of technology they were using, is relatively straightforward. Not always, but usually it's quite simple. So I don't know when they started testing. They could have started testing a couple of years ago or even 10 years ago, and they just simply couldn't identify a person to match it to.
Okay. All right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
All right, Bicca Barlow, thank you so much for coming in and giving us a little bit of insight into how this whole DNA world works when it comes to solving crimes.
No
Thank
problem.
you.
Thank you.
That huge break in a cold case terrorizing California for decades. Police say they now have the Golden State Killer in custody.
And they used DNA testing to find him. So many families are relieved this morning.
The killer accused of murdering at least 12 people, sexually assaulting more than 50. 72-year-old Joseph James D'Angelo, former police officer, family man who is hiding in plain sight in suburban Sacramento. ABC's Whit Johnson is there with new details on this stunning break. Good morning, Whit.
George, good morning to you. Absolute shock in this quiet community that the man who terrorized California may have been living right here. The Golden State Killer vanished in the 80s, gone for decades, until investigators say a key piece of DNA evidence connected the dots just days ago.
The 40-year manhunt for one of the most prolific serial criminals in American history, perhaps coming to an end at this suburban home.
We found the needle in the haystack, and it was right here in Sacramento.
Police say this man, 72-year-old Joseph James D'Angelo, is the elusive Golden State Killer. The former police officer allegedly responsible for at least 12 murders, upwards of 50 rapes, and more than 100 burglaries in California from 1976 to 1986. D'Angelo's name never coming up in prior investigations, but just 6 days ago, a critical clue.
We started some surveillance. We were able to get some discarded DNA, and we were able to confirm what we thought we already knew, that we had our man.
D'Angelo seemingly hiding in plain sight. Police surprising him and taking him into custody on Tuesday as he was leaving his home.
For the 51 ladies who were brutally raped in this crime scene, sleep better tonight. He isn't coming through the window. He's now in jail, and he's history. Thank you.
D'Angelo's arrest bringing relief to victims and their families.
I woke up to a text from a very good friend of mine who said,
do you think this is really the guy? And it had an article attached saying that they had somebody, they had made an arrest. And I just started shaking. I never in my lifetime expected to see that.
Authorities say he worked as an officer at 2 different police departments until he was reportedly fired in 1979 for shoplifting dog repellent and a hammer.
Very possibly he was committing the crimes during the time he was employed as a peace officer.
Also known as the original Night Stalker and East Area Rapist, the killer taunted police and his victims with phone calls long after the attacks. Leaving the entire state on edge. A significant development came in the mid-90s. DNA testing connecting the puzzle pieces to one unknown person. Crime writer Michelle McNamara, who coined the phrase the Golden State Killer, made it her life's work to hunt him down. She discussed the serial killer in an interview with filmmaker Cameron Cloutier.
I'm very struck by that people did not call out, you know, that there was a weird guy hanging around. So he had to to fit in. But on the other hand, it's just the level of violence is so extreme.
McNamara died in 2016, but with the help of her researchers and husband, comedian Patton Oswalt, her book I'll Be Gone in the Dark was completed and released in February. It debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, sparking national interest in the case.
You did it, Michelle, even though the cops are never going to say it, but your book helped get this thing closed.
And charges against D'Angelo continue to pile up. Prosecutors believe that key piece of DNA evidence will link him to perhaps dozens of crimes spanning 10 counties. They're promising more charges in the coming days. Robin?
We're going to talk more about that, Whit. Thank you with Sacramento District Attorney Anne-Marie Schubert, who joins us live this morning. What a relief. So many people relieved waking up this morning. And we know that this case has been cold for decades, and D'Angelo's name didn't even surface until just 6 days ago. Is that right?
That's correct. That's correct.
And the discarded DNA, it didn't come from a tip from coming into your office. So tell us a little bit more about the discarded DNA and how that was the key.
Well, as we said yesterday, this case was really solved through some innovative DNA techniques. And so as a result of that, that led to law enforcement essentially, as the sheriff said yesterday, surveilling him and obtaining a sample of abandoned or discarded DNA. And from there, we moved forward and they did additional testing, and that was ultimately what solved this case.
My goodness. We know that he was once married. He was a police officer, an officer at the time of the crimes. When you look at grown children, how does he fit the profile that investigators were working with at the time?
Well, he was never on a list, so now we're at a point now, as I said yesterday, this is like lightning speed, so everything is now it's an active investigation, but I think all those answers are going to be filled in over time, though.
It is an active investigation. We appreciate you sharing as much as you are, and we heard in the report, as right now he's been charged with the first 2 known killings in the so-called Golden State killing. How many more do you suspect? And we know that the last killing was in 1986, but will he possibly look to for other cases since that time?
Yeah, they'll absolutely look for additional cases. What we know now is that he's responsible for at least 12, perhaps 13. I'm fully confident he will be charged with additional counts of murder because he's linked by DNA to several other murders, including Orange County.
Anne-Marie
and Santa Barbara County.
And Santa Barbara County. Ma'am, what do you want to say to people about the work that went into this? And even though it was decades old, that your office and everyone was not going to let this go unsolved?
Well, it's all about passion and persistence and ultimately about DNA. And I've always believed that DNA is a silent witness to the truth. And that truth may have been quieted for 40-something years, but we're now here and we have the answer.
We appreciate your work very much, Anne-Marie Schubert. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.
New information shows how police used genealogy websites to try to identify the notorious Golden State Killer. Police arrested Joseph James D'Angelo on Tuesday after crime scene DNA partially matched a relative's on one of those sites. D'Angelo is accused in a decades-old crime spree across 10 California counties. John Blackstone is at the jail in Sacramento, where the 72-year-old will be arraigned this afternoon. John, good morning.
Good morning. Well, Joseph D'Angelo will face a judge here today at the Sacramento County Jail. The alleged Golden State Killer was careful not to leave behind any incriminating clues. He couldn't have possibly known he'd be unmasked by his own DNA more than 40 years later.
The Golden State Killer wore a ski mask and left no fingerprints while committing more than 50 rapes and a dozen murders. But he did leave behind his genetic code, the final piece of the puzzle for Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert and her investigators.
I believe very strongly that it's the greatest tool ever given to law enforcement.
Agents extracted the suspect's genetic profile from decades-old crime scene evidence and then searched genealogy websites for matches. They got a partial hit from someone related to Joseph James D'Angelo on gedmatch.com. Police say another DNA test confirmed the 72-year-old ex-police officer was the Golden State Killer.
I was hugely excited.
Ruth Ballard runs the forensic biology program at California State University, Sacramento.
I didn't really think they were going to solve this case, quite frankly.
D'Angelo's brother-in-law is in disbelief.
I would have never suspected. We had a family type relationship, so we joked and we hunted, went boating.
He favors quiet upper class suburbs, usually works in the pre-dawn hours and often spends several hours in the home.
The Golden State Killer snuck through windows and surprised his victims, even eating food from their refrigerators while they were tied up. The crime spree lasted from 1974 to 1986.
Around the mid-'80s, that was when the first cases were being solved using DNA. And so it was on the radar, I think, of criminals that were savvy.
That may have been the reason this stopped mysteriously in the mid-'80s.
It's possible.
CBS This Morning contacted other genealogy websites to see if they'd provided any help to investigators. Ancestry.com, 23andMe, GenCove, and DNA Land all denied being involved. Nora?
All right, John, thank you.
The story is so chilling to me that it's a police officer, because the police officer could have such access to information about this case. Yeah. And who would look at a police officer for something like this?
I like the idea for somebody who is as gruesome as this. If this is true,
yes,
you can't hide, no matter how long ago it was.
No, and not his DNA, but a DNA of a relative that led to him.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
It is amazing.
Right now, California's alleged Golden State Killer is raising privacy concerns about websites that use DNA to trace your ancestry. 72-year-old James D'Angelo was arrested this week after authorities matched the crime scene DNA with genetic material stored by a distant relative on the website gedmatch.com. He is suspected of 12 murders, 45 rapes, and 120 burglaries, and they all happened in California in the 70s and the 80s. Pete Zervakis has been researching the companies that offer to collect your DNA. He joins us live now with what he has discovered. Pete.
Well, Carol, most of those companies collect your saliva and the DNA contained in it. They then send you a report about where your family comes from.
I was just more interested in finding out where my lineage is from.
That's why Maggie Benavides sent her DNA to a website which mailed her back the same type of genetic profile that authorities in California used to arrest the suspected Golden State Killer. Investigators found that profile publicly with no court order and compared it to DNA collected at crime scenes.
This is an incredibly powerful tool to be able to identify individuals.
According to an expert on bioethics, there's no law blocking investigators from asking companies that collect DNA to hand over samples.
This is, the perfect identifier, better than fingerprints, better than blood type.
Several of the popular websites told us they do not turn over DNA to investigators, at least without a court order. As a follow-up to the arrest in California, one company added its platform does not support the comparison of genetic data processed by any third party to genetic profiles within our database. Maggie would pay more attention to the fine print if submitting her DNA now, but she would do it again.
I've got new cousins, so no regrets.
Now, none of those companies gave us details on how long they hold a DNA sample for after you submit it. In the meantime, the Wisconsin Department of Justice tells me they have so far not tried to obtain a court order to get a DNA sample from any such website. So there is right now no precedent, at least here in Wisconsin, about how a court would rule in that case. Live in downtown Milwaukee, Pete Zervakis, today's TMJ4.
Yeah, the science is amazing. Pete, thank you very much.
Last week, investigators in California arrested a man they believe is the Golden State Killer, a serial murderer and rapist whose crimes terrorized the state in the 1970s and 80s. As William Brangham reports, the arrest is considered a huge success for law enforcement, but it also raises questions about the unique method used to find the suspect.
This is the man accused of being the Golden State Killer, 72-year-old former police officer Joseph DeAngelo, as he appeared in a Sacramento court last Friday. The Golden State Killer has been linked to at least 12 murders, 50 rapes, and a string of burglaries throughout California. Variously known as the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker, these were brutal, meticulously planned crimes that spanned numerous California counties between 1976 and 1986.
The police are saying lock up tight. Sacramento's infamous East Area Rapist may still be in town.
As the crimes escalated and police couldn't find a suspect, Californians grew increasingly terrified. Investigator Paul Holes, who tracked the Golden State Killer for decades, described the relief many felt with this arrest.
Right now, the biggest rewards that I have gotten is when I've called the handful of victims that I've had some relationship with. Very rewarding to at least hear the relief in their voices, that, you know, they can now kind of relax in a way. This guy is behind bars. He's never getting out. And some of these victims had thought, he's going to come back and get me. So they lived in that fear.
DeAngelo's arrest has been cause for celebration, but it's also raising questions over how he was located and whether law enforcement has opened a Pandora's box with new DNA technology.
Investigators took DNA of the suspected killer from an old crime scene and they uploaded it to a public genealogy database called GED Match. It's the kind that people use to track down distant relatives or trace their own ancestry. On that site, investigators were able to find what seemed to be a distant relative of the suspected killer, a great-great-great-grandparent from the 1800s.
Then, investigators followed the dozens of family trees branching off this one grandparent, and using census data, old newspapers, and death records, were able to home in on two men who were in California at the time of the attacks. A final DNA test, done on a discarded piece of trash, confirmed that the second man, Joseph DeAngelo, was the suspect.
An incredible collaboration.
Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert cheered the technique used to identify the suspect.
The answer was and always was going to be in the DNA.
Joseph DeAngelo returns to court on May 14th. He has yet to enter a plea.
For more on how the Golden State suspect was apprehended, I'm joined now by the woman who will prosecute him. Anne Marie Schubert is the district attorney for Sacramento County. Welcome to the NewsHour.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So this is obviously an enormous moment for California and for Sacramento in particular. And I wonder if you could just take us back, for people who didn't live through it or weren't in California at the time, just what it was like in the late 70s and early 80s for people living with this constant fear of these crimes going on.
Sure. I think it's almost difficult to explain to folks what it was like. I mean, I know it because I grew up here at the time and I was 12 when it first started to happen. And for really anybody that lived in Sacramento at the time, it changed us. It changed our community. It went from a very, I would say, innocent town where people left their doors unlocked, they left their windows open, they knew nothing about self-defense, anything like, to a time when it happened so often and it was so much on the news that it wasn't a matter of if it was going to happen again, it was a matter of when. And so it really terrorized this community. It's almost difficult to explain. It's almost like living through an earthquake and trying to explain that process of what it's like to go through that. But it really did change this community in many, many ways.
Obviously, you used a very unique technique to finally identify him. And I explained a little bit of this, how you went about this beforehand. But could you tell us a little bit more about how did you come up with this idea? How did you execute this?
Well, I don't want to take credit for the idea. There was a team of folks that worked on it. And so, my credit, I guess, is just kind of making sure that we had a team approach going to this. But, it was essentially using innovative technology. I think everybody knows now that it was using some genealogy sites and using the DNA to the best of our ability. And as I said, a group of folks building the trees of this genealogy, which was very, very labor intensive. Very, very long process, but ultimately it led to Mr. DeAngelo.
Obviously, everyone in California seems very glad, if he is in fact the killer, to have this man in custody. But some have raised concerns that law enforcement dipping into these big DNA databases is some form of overreach. And I wonder, what do you say to that concern?
Well, I think what's important for people to remember is that this is and has been one of the most significant unsolved serial rape murder cases of all time here in California. And the level of violent crime, the number of crimes, I understand there's a conversation folks want to have about, privacy and things like that, but there is a balance here, and there's this, what I would call this public safety balance. And so I'm sure that this process will play out not only in public debate, but also in a courtroom. And ultimately, we're confident that at the end of the day, when the sample was collected from, as I call it, a discarded sample that then matches Mr. DeAngelo, that we're going to prevail.
I mean, obviously, again, in this case, it proved incredibly useful, and it seems to have pulled a very dangerous man into police custody. But do you understand those concerns that people raise, that perhaps when I give my DNA to one of these websites, I don't really ever expect it to be part of a police investigation that may not occur for years down the line? And do you understand the concern that people raise that I don't want my DNA in some kind of a dragnet somewhere down the road?
I understand the conversation. I actually do. And I also understand what, the company GEDmatch put out after this occurred, which is essentially that folks that have put their information in there were on notice. And so that I understand that. Again, I will say that this particular situation was not a matter of solving, a car theft or burglaries. This was magnitude of this case was extraordinary, and law enforcement did what they felt was necessary to ultimately, and it did, in fact, lead us to the conclusion.
With one question about the specifics of this case, when we see people upload their DNA to these sites, usually you're uploading your own DNA or the DNA of someone who you are the guardian for. That was not the case in this case. Are you concerned at all about the legality of the evidence in this particular instance?
Well, I'm quite confident this is going to play out in a courtroom, and everything that was done was put into an open source site. The GEDmatch. So I understand the public conversation about it, but as I said, I'm confident this is going to play out in a courtroom.
Lastly, before I let you go, I'd like to just shift to another case. Obviously, there's still a great deal of concern and outrage in Sacramento about the shooting death of Stephon Clark by two police officers. And a lot of people in the community have been arguing that you need to act quicker to prosecute the police officers for that shooting. Can you just tell us where that stands? Why hasn't that happened yet?
Well, the short answer is that we have not received any case from law enforcement yet to review on that. As I've said many, many times, these cases when it does get received at our office, it will take a period of time. My job as the district attorney is to do a full, fair, and independent review. So, one, we don't have the case, and two, when we do have the case, along with the Attorney General, I'm quite confident we're going to do that. But I understand people's frustration, but I was elected to do a job, and I intend to do that.
All right. Anne Marie Schubert, District Attorney for Sacramento County. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
New developments in the Golden State Killer case. New DNA tests and photos could help link Joseph DeAngelo to a spree of crimes across California. ABC's Whit Johnson is tracking the case from Los Angeles. And Whit, DeAngelo's lawyers tried to stop these tests from taking place.
That's right, George. Good morning to you. Prosecutors requested that additional evidence in an effort to connect Joseph DeAngelo to as many of the murders as possible. One of the original investigators told me why that information, including specific photographs of his body, is so critical to the case.
Inside this Sacramento courthouse, a judge ruling that prosecutors may collect additional DNA, fingerprints, and photos from Joseph DeAngelo. Evidence, they say, could further connect him to the laundry list of murders and rapes he's accused of. Prosecutors especially interested in knowing if DeAngelo shares the same physical abnormality described by some of his alleged victims. A lead Carol Daly, one of the original investigators, thoroughly explored.
We said, all right, if he is so under-endowed, we went to a specialist, a doctor, to see if he had any patients that came in. And
you actually went to a doctor to see if the size of his anatomy was unique or rare?
Yes. I told you, there was not a stone left unturned that we did in trying to identify this rapist. And we didn't have any luck there.
Despite the clues, the serial killer would elude authorities for decades, striking again and again, then taunting some of his victims with chilling phone calls. This morning, we're learning more about the man suspected of 12 murders and more than 50 rapes. Retired Auburn Police Chief Nick Willick fired DeAngelo from the force in 1979.
He really violated people's space all the time. When he talked to you, he'd get kind of close to your face and always be touching you.
He was very touchy.
Yes, he was. And, I remember one time I told him, because I said, Joe, my mother doesn't touch me as much as you do.
Jennifer Carroll's father, Lyman Smith, and stepmother Charlene were murdered in 1980. The same DNA found at that crime scene, investigators say, would ultimately lead to DeAngelo. Decades of living in fear, now replaced with overwhelming relief.
The key being the key, yep.
And that means a lot to you.
It does. That's justice, right? That's justice. That's something we believe in our family, and that is it coming all together. That's justice.
And some of the victims telling us they can finally sleep after a years-long nightmare. Joseph DeAngelo has not yet entered a plea. He remains in a wheelchair on suicide watch and with no bail. George?
Okay, Whit, thanks very much. I know you're going to have much more on the Golden State Killer tonight on 2020 at 10, 9 Central, right here on ABC. Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.
Well, if you've ever submitted your DNA to a genealogy database in search of relatives
We've both done
or
that.
information about your ancestry, something you and I have both done, there is something you should know. In certain cases, your DNA profile may be accessed by law enforcement to help track down criminals. I didn't know that.
Yep, that is exactly what happened in a murder investigation. And for more than 2 years, I've been following this case for 48 hours.
My name is Carol Dodge, and I am the mother of Angie Dodge, who was brutally murdered in June of 1996. And for 23 years, I've traveled every road there is to find justice for my daughter.
When her daughter Angie was first murdered, Carol Dodge thought the killer would be brought to justice quickly. Idaho Falls police had his DNA, a pristine sample, says DNA expert Greg Hampikian.
It's a single profile, complete identification, one man to the exclusion of everyone on the planet.
But for nearly 2 decades, police couldn't find a match to the DNA, not even in the criminal database. So in 2014, Carol Dodge pushed then case detective Patrick McKenna to do something very controversial. Search public DNA databases in search of the killer or anyone related to him.
My whole purpose is to find who killed Angie Dodge.
Detectives searched a small database owned by Ancestry.com, which used to be public, and got a hit.
It led us to this Michael Usry Jr., who just happened to be a filmmaker.
Michael Usry was living in New Orleans, Louisiana, trying to break into the film industry.
I shoved her body over in the shower. I just kept stabbing her.
With this short film called Murderabilia.
Murderabilia
got me the reputation of being a person who is really into murder and things like that.
Police picked Usry up for questioning and collected his DNA.
They finally had to look at me and go, no, we think that you, Michael Usry, we think that you're involved in this murder case.
Usry turned out not to be the killer, but in the end, the man who did match the DNA was actually a distant relative Usry didn't even know existed. A man who, in 1996, was living just across the street from Angie Dodge.
So 48 Hours asked Ancestry.com about Usry's experience. In a statement, they said that they will not share any information with law enforcement unless compelled to by a court order or a search warrant. Usry's case, they say, was unique, and that it's really the only time they've ever received a formal legal request for DNA-related information. After what happened to Usry, Ancestry.com said they took action. The public database that was used by authorities was made private, and it can no longer be accessed by the public or police.
So because it's been made private, going forward, law enforcement does not have access to our DNA.
Right. So in this case,
and I don't mean me, because I've done nothing wrong, but I mean the American people.
Right.
Whoever.
This was long before any of these familial DNA cases, like the higher profile ones, like the Golden State Killer and stuff like that.
Right.
So Ancestry really did not expect law enforcement to do that. And what they did was they submitted the DNA like they would be, me or you, looking for a relative, a long-lost relative. And then once they got a hit, they got a warrant to find out the information connected to that hit and the name connected to that hit.
Okay.
So that can't happen anymore with Ancestry. They have locked it down.
Right, but the alleged killer actually lived across the street when the crime was committed. So having to go through Ancestry.com, maybe a little bit of police work in the neighborhood.
Well, here's the thing, is they took DNA samples from tons of men, a lot of men. They asked people to come in voluntarily, and many, many did. But they were focused on the victim, Angie. They were focused on her friends, people connected to her, maybe, guys that partied with her. This guy lived across the street. He's much older. He's married. She had literally just moved in. She had no reason to sort of have any interaction or contact. So even though they questioned him, they never took his DNA.
So why did they think that Michael Usry was the killer?
This is also really interesting. So the hit was actually not on Usry. It was on his father. His father had submitted his DNA to a research project at his church. It's an area of the country where there are a lot of Mormons. Some researchers approached the people at the church and said, we're looking to do some DNA stuff with Mormons. And so he submitted his DNA to this research project. When the researchers were done and finished with it, that DNA database was sold to Ancestry.com.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And you know what, Vlad? This is one tiny little part of the story. There's a whole other part where somebody confessed to being at the murder scene and sat in prison for 19 years, even though they had never been there.
What?
That's a whole other part to the story.
Wow,
It's I'm not just saying it because I'm doing
I know.
It's a really good case.
You're kind of a skeptical, like, it takes a lot to get you to be like, this is really interesting.
This is a one-of-a-kind case, for sure.
Right, cool.
So you can see my report, The Twisted Case of Angie Dodge, on 48 Hours, tomorrow night at 10, 9 Central on CBS.
Here we are today at a DNA Diagnostic Center collection site. I've brought along identification for myself and my daughter to ensure that we follow a proper chain of custody. A proper chain of custody will allow us to follow the samples throughout the entire testing process.
The first step was to fill out an identification form that required my thumbprint and the thumbprint of my daughter for identification purposes. Next, they had us take a photo to ensure proper identification of everyone that was being tested. Now it's on to collect my DNA. In the past, blood samples were a common method used to collect DNA. Today's methods are much easier. DNA can just as easily be collected from my cheek cells as from a blood sample. To avoid cross-contamination, the sample collector changes gloves before collecting the next sample. Now, I know I had mentioned earlier that it was simple and painless. It sure is. You can tell by the smile on my daughter's face. Once our samples were collected, the swabs were placed in an envelope and then sealed with tamper-proof tape. The collector will bring it over so I can verify the information on the envelope. This will ensure that we follow the proper chain of custody all the way through the entire testing process. Once it's verified, I'll go ahead and sign for approval, showing that I've read this information. That's it. The process is painless, quick, and easy. I'd highly advise those of you in need of paternity test to use a qualified laboratory. At this time, I'd like to thank the staff of DDC for walking us through the entire paternity testing process. For further questions, please visit their website at www.dnacenter.com. Thanks, and have a great day.
Horrifying saga of the so-called Golden State Killer, his victims calling him a monster, as the judge ensures that Joseph DeAngelo will die in prison. DeAngelo himself addressed the court before receiving 11 consecutive life sentences, and ABC's Zoreen Shaw is on the story from L.A. Zoreen, good morning to you.
Good morning, Dan. A judge gave the 74-year-old convicted killer and rapist life in prison without parole. This after numerous women stood up, saying how DeAngelo had robbed them of years of their lives, speaking of the terror he caused them. The former police officer known as the Golden State Killer, one of the world's most infamous killers and rapists, rose from his wheelchair in court Friday to apologize to his victims.
And I'm truly sorry.
Joseph DeAngelo sentenced to life without parole after confessing to 13 murders and more than 50 rapes in the 70s and 80s in California. Chris Pedretti, a rape victim at age 15, was one of the survivors, telling the court DeAngelo took a piece of her life.
He stole my youth, my innocence. Who could I have grown up to be? I guess I'll never know.
DeAngelo didn't just attack his victims. Family members say their loved ones were sometimes left beaten beyond recognition. He stalked others, tormenting them with chilling phone calls before he struck. Overnight, Sacramento's district attorney reacting to his sentencing.
It's time. It's just time. It's time for these families. I'm just so grateful that we got to this day.
After investigators pieced together clues about DeAngelo's DNA from public genealogy websites, they captured him 2 years ago, living a life openly in plain sight. He was wheeled into his court hearings, appearing as a frail suspect, often heard muttering.
I've listened to all your statements.
But prosecutors showing this from his jail cell, appearing to do arm exercises, even clambering up to his desk, showing a killer still very much in control. The Golden State Killer will die in prison, and while investigators were able to find him and bring justice for victims, 2 unsolved questions remain and may never be answered. Why he killed and raped people, and then why he suddenly stopped 34 years ago. Eva?
It's 2 questions that those victims will be thinking about.
Yeah.
Well, hey there, GMA fans. Robin Roberts here. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Lots of great stuff here. So go on, click the subscribe button right over here to get more of awesome videos and content from GMA every day, anytime. We thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the morning on GMA.
There are some other headlines this evening. The man known as the Golden State Killer will spend the rest of his life in prison. That's Joseph DeAngelo, who pled guilty to raping and killing multiple women throughout the state in the 1970s and 80s.
Today, DeAngelo was unmasked and spoke publicly to his victims. NBC Barry's Tom Jensen reports from Sacramento.
Before the sentence was handed down, Joseph DeAngelo stood up out of his wheelchair and spoke clearly to victims.
And I'm really sorry.
Few words from the Golden State Killer, a man whose crimes prosecutors say stretched from 1973 until 1986, and who continued to terrorize women even up until his arrest in 2018.
No window is ever open or unlocked at night.
Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert reading from a 71-year-old woman's email, a reporter who grew up in the area. Contra Costa County's DA joined others in calling for multiple life sentences for someone they all described as a monster and a sociopath.
The man whose horrific, unspeakable crimes devastated the lives of so many people.
DA Diana Beckton told us she talked to a victim this morning who has been waiting for this day for almost 40 years.
She said, "Today I feel free. I feel like a weight has been lifted off of me.
A Santa Cruz woman whose father and stepmother were bludgeoned to death by D'Angelo inside their Orange County home in 1980 talked to us about how cold case detectives linked DNA from her stepmother's rape kit to D'Angelo.
And without it, I truly don't believe he would have been here.
Following the sentencing, prosecutors released this video of D'Angelo in his Sacramento County jail cell, showing a very different man than the one who came to court every day in a wheelchair.
The chilling moment in the sentencing of one of America's most notorious serial killers, the sentencing of the Golden State Killer in California. Former police officer Joseph D'Angelo Jr. sentenced to life with no parole, confessing to 13 murders and more than 50 rapes in the 1970s and 80s. Well, after days of hearing from survivors, he rose from his wheelchair and addressed them. Here's ABC's Matt Gutman.
For decades, the man you see prowling his jail cell let murder and rape speak for him.
I've listened to all your statements.
But tonight, the Golden State Killer muttering this apology to his victims.
And I'm truly sorry.
Moments later, Joe D'Angelo was sentenced to life without parole. Cold comfort to Chris Pedretti, raped when she was 15.
He stole my youth, my innocence. Who could I have grown up to be? I guess I'll never know.
He was one of the most sadistic serial killers in history, even taunting victims with phone calls. He was captured living in plain sight in 2018. In his sentencing, D'Angelo played the invalid, but in that jail cell video, he's stretching, climbing on a desk. The killer still trying to control the narrative. D'Angelo will die in prison and likely take to the grave with him two mysteries, David. What caused that murder and rape spree and why he abruptly ended it in 1986. David.
All right, Matt Gutman reporting live from California tonight. Matt, thank you.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.
Joseph D'Angelo, known as the Golden State Killer, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole today. Now, back in June, D'Angelo, a former police officer, pleaded guilty to 13 murders and dozens of sex crimes over several decades. The 74-year-old spoke briefly today after listening to days of statements from victims.
I've listened to all your statements, each one of them. And I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt. Thank you, Your Honor.
D'Angelo lived in San Diego in the 1960s. He trained at the old Navy Training Center in Point Loma, which is now Liberty Station.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tanya Rivero. Thank you for joining us. The infamous Golden State Killer has been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
I've listened to all your statements, each one of them. And I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt.
74-year-old Joseph D'Angelo pleaded guilty to 13 murders and 13 rape-related charges across California. They happened between 1975 and 1986. D'Angelo is a former police officer. He also admitted to dozens more sexual assaults for which the statute of limitations had expired. Victims and their families got the chance to confront D'Angelo in court over the last few days.
What a story this is. The suspected Golden State Killer was back in a courtroom today. A judge ruled that prosecutors can collect DNA and fingerprints from Joseph D'Angelo, who is believed to be behind at least a dozen killings and more than 50 rapes during the 70s and 80s. So just last week, after decades on the run, he was tracked down in part by detectives who used genealogy websites like Ancestry and 23andMe. They don't know exactly which one it was, but it has a lot of people wondering what exactly you give up when you spit and send your DNA to those sites. It's something to think about. America, we'll talk more about that another night. But my next guest is retired Exeter, California Police Sergeant Farrell Ward. He worked side by side along the alleged serial killer for 3 years. Farrell, welcome. Good to have you here tonight, sir. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
I just can't even imagine. I read about how you spent a lot of time side by side. You never suspected him of anything like this. What was it like when you saw his picture and realized how close you had been to him all those years?
I was devastated. I just couldn't believe that one of our guys could do something like that.
Tell me what he was like. What he is like.
Pardon me?
Tell me what he's like and what he was like then that led you to not suspect anything at all.
Well, he's a nice guy, but he's just off kind of by himself. Like he was educated person, but he didn't have no common sense. He didn't like to joke around, play around, or anything. He just kind of standoffish type guy.
So you say that, you know, he was around you, he was in your house, around your family. What is it like when you hear about these murders and these rapes and you realize that it could have happened to any one of you?
Yes, very much could. I had him in my house. We drank tea. He's even had dinner with me, because when we worked together, if the person lives out of town, then I usually invite him to my house, because my wife cooked every night, and I would have one of the guys come have dinner with me at nighttime. So I had my wife and my daughter there, and never thought for a moment that something like this would happen.
Is there anything looking back, Farrell, that you think about when you think about things that he said or did that maybe shed some light on what was going on?
There was nothing. I couldn't believe it when I saw him on TV, but there was no indication whatsoever that this guy had any dark side to him whatsoever. And he was just another policeman, just like any of the other guys.
During that period, did you talk about this killer that was on the loose with him?
Well, yeah, we talked about the killing in Visalia, where he killed the college professor. He tried to kidnap his 14-year-old daughter, and the father came into the room to help his daughter, and he was shot dead right there in front of his daughter.
And you talked to him about that crime at the time?
Yes.
And what was his reaction
not
to
just him, but they just didn't know who the sick guy was that would do something like that, just like the other policemen that we talked about, different things. And Visalia PD, they investigated it, the incident, and then the next week, Visalia Police Department put guys in different neighborhoods. The police officers dropped them off in different parts of the city. And that night, there was a policeman that found him in the backyard. And they teach us in our training to hold your flashlight away from your body. So he was holding out his flashlight, and this guy shot directly into his flashlight and just blew it all apart. And luckily that didn't kill the police officer. And this guy just jumped directly over the fence, 6-foot fence, and he disappeared. And at the time, I was a K-9 officer. So Visalia Police called me out to help search the residential area and the backyards. And we couldn't locate the guy anywhere. He was gone.
Oh my gosh, it's chilling. Farrell Ward, thank you very much, sir. Thanks for sharing your story. We're glad he's finally in custody. It's an amazing story you tell. Thank you, sir.